The pale sunlight of Eldoria always felt like a cage, filtering through stained glass windows that celebrated ancient wars and human dominance. Princess Lyra stood in the heart of the throne room, her silver gown heavy with the weight of a life she never asked for. The fabric, stiff with embroidery and pearls, felt like a layer of armor designed not to protect her, but to pin her to the floor. Beside her, Lord Valerius wore a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was the man her father, King Theron, had chosen to secure their borders, a man known for his cruelty and his hatred of the wild. "The union is decreed," her father's voice boomed, weary but absolute. The sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, bouncing between the marble pillars like a death sentence. Lyra felt Valerius's hand tighten on her arm, a possessive grip that made her skin crawl. She looked at her father, seeing only a ruler obsessed with control, a man who viewed his daughters as pieces on a chessboard to be traded for terrain. Then she looked toward the shadows of the grand archway, where her handmaiden Eldoria stood trembling. Her eyes filled with a pity that Lyra found harder to bear than the king's apathy. Lyra's mind drifted to the market square weeks ago. She remembered the scent of wet fur and iron, the sight of a massive dark wolf caged and bleeding while villagers threw stones. The animal was magnificent even in its misery, its coat a midnight black that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. She had seen an intelligence in its amber eyes that surpassed any human she knew, a deep, ancient sorrow that spoke of forests older than the kingdom itself. That night, where she had bribed the guards with her mother's sapphire ring, tended the creature's wounds with stolen salves, and watched it vanish into the tree line without a single sound. That memory was her only sanctuary until a low, familiar growl echoed from beneath her balcony later that evening. The palace was silent, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant salt of the sea. Looking down, she saw him, the same dark wolf, waiting in the silvered moonlight. He didn't pace, he simply sat, a shadow among shadows, his eyes glowing like embers. It was a silent invitation to a world her father called monstrous, a world that promised nothing but the chance to breathe. With a small satchel of essentials and a heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, Lyra slipped past the palace sentries. She knew the shifts of the guards better than they did, having spent years sneaking into the library or the gardens to escape her lessons. She didn't look back at the stone walls of her childhood. She followed the wolf into the dense, misty forests of the north, where the trees grew so thick the stars disappeared. The journey lasted for days. The landscape changed from the rolling hills of Eldoria to the jagged, gray stone foothills of the mountain range. The air grew thinner and colder, biting at her skin through her travel cloak. But the wolf was a constant, watchful presence. He brought her small game he had hunted and guided her through paths that seemed to shift like spirits. On the third night, as they huddled in a cave to escape a mountain gale, Lyra reached out and touched his fur. It was coarse and warm, and for the first time in 19 years, she felt safe. When they finally crossed the high ridge into the Northlands, the wolf stopped. The valley below was a sprawling expanse of pine and frozen lakes, untouched by the plows of men. In a blur of rippling muscle and shifting bone, the beast became a man. The transformation was silent, a graceful folding of the physical world. He was Kaelen, alpha of the Stonefang Pack. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, his amber eyes piercing through her defenses. His skin was bronzed despite the cold, marked here and there by the white lines of old scars. He wasn't the mindless beast of Eldorian legends. He was a king of the wild, stoic, and formidable. Beside him stood Rhys, the wolf she had saved, now in human form and looking at her with a gratitude that made her heart ache. "You are far from your gilded cage, princess," Kaelen said. His voice was a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very ground beneath her boots. He looked at her not as a prize, but as a curiosity, a fragile thing that had wandered into a den of lions. "I seek refuge," Lyra replied, her voice steadying despite the shivering of her limbs. "I would rather face the monsters of the north than the man my father chose for me. In Eldoria, I am a commodity. Here, I hope to be a person." Kaelen's gaze was dissecting, weighing her soul against the harshness of his world. "We are not monsters, but we are not kind to those who bring the scent of Eldoria into our home. Your people have hunted us for generations. You will stay, not as a guest, but as a ward. You will learn our ways, or the winter will take you before the moon cycles." The weeks that followed were a trial of fire and ice. Lyra traded her silk for cured leather and her embroidery needles for a balanced hunting blade. The transition was brutal. The Lycans did not coddle her. She was expected to carry her weight, to haul wood from the frozen forests, and to help skin the kills that fed the pack. Under the watchful, often harsh tutelage of Kaelen, she learned to track by the scent of crushed pine needles, to hunt with a bow, and to move with the predatory grace of the pack. She saw the way the Lycans lived, not as savages, but as a family bound by a primal, unbreakable loyalty. They shared everything, their food, their warmth, and their grief. There was a transparency to their lives that Eldoria lacked. In the palace, every word was a double-edged sword, while here, a growl meant anger, and a lean meant trust. She also found herself drawn to Kaelen in a way that terrified her. He was a storm contained in a man's body, brooding and intense, yet she caught glimpses of the burden he carried as a protector. He stayed awake during the coldest nights, patrolling the perimeter of their timber-walled village. During a late-night sparring session in the training pits, his hand lingered on hers as he corrected her stance, his warmth seeping through her gloves. The spark that flared between them was more than adrenaline. It was an ancient, fated pull that felt as if it had been written in the stars before the first king was ever crowned. "You're thinking like a human," Kaelen muttered one evening as they sat by a dying fire. "You're waiting for permission to strike. In the wild, permission is for the dead. You take what is yours, or you lose it. In Eldoria, taking what is mine is called treason," Lyra countered, looking into the flames. "Here," Kaelen said, his voice dropping an octave, "it is called survival." But the peace of the north was short-lived. King Theron, fueled by Valerius's wounded pride and the loss of the strategic alliance Lyra represented, sent a decree. It arrived not by messenger, but by fire. A border outpost of the Stonefang was burned, and the message was left carved into a charred tree. "Return the princess, or the north will burn." The pack was restless, their growls vibrating through the village like distant thunder. They looked at Lyra with suspicion, seeing the catalyst for their destruction. Lyra knew she couldn't let the pack bleed for her, so she couldn't let Rhys or Kaelen pay the price for her escape. She stepped before the Lycan Council, a circle of elders whose eyes were clouded with age but sharp with wisdom. She proposed the way of the First Kings, an ancient human challenge of single combat to settle the dispute. It was a law written in the founding scrolls of Eldoria, one that her father could not ignore without losing the respect of his own lords. Kaelen protested, his protective instincts warring with his respect for her growth. "Valerius is a butcher. He has spent his life killing. You have spent weeks training." "Then make sure those weeks count," Lyra said, her eyes meeting his. "If I go back as a prisoner, I am dead anyway. Let me fight for my life." The clearing at the border was a sea of tension, a narrow strip of land where the golden leaves of the south met the dark pines of the north. On one side stood the iron-clad soldiers of Eldoria, their shields reflecting the harsh morning sun. On the other, the fierce, fur-clad warriors of the Stonefang, their breath misting in the air. Valerius stepped forward, his heavy broadsword gleaming, his face twisted in a sneer that spoke of easy victory. He looked at Lyra in her leather armor and laughed. "I see you've traded your crown for dog collars, Lyra. It's time to come home and learn your place." He found a wolf instead of a girl. The fight was a blur of steel and snow. Valerius fought with the heavy, predictable power of a man used to breaking his opponents. Lyra, however, moved with a fluid ferocity that left the human soldiers stunned. She didn't fight like a princess. She fought with the instinct Kaelen had beaten into her in the mud and the cold. She used Valerius's own weight against him, dodging his heavy swings and striking with the precision of a hunter. She felt the pack behind her, not just their presence, but their spirit. Every time she felt her lungs burn, she heard the mental howl of the wolves. When Valerius finally caught her with a backhand that sent her sprawling into the dirt, it was Kaelen's voice in her head that told her to move. She rolled as the broadsword slammed into the ground where her head had been a second before. Scrambling up, she used his momentum. As he pulled his sword from the earth, she drove her shoulder into his chest and swept his legs. When she finally sent his sword clattering into the dirt and held her short blade to his throat, the silence in the clearing was absolute. "I am free by the old laws," Lyra declared, her voice ringing through the trees, steady and cold. She looked at her father, seeing his shock and his shame, seeing the man who would have sold her for a few miles of borderland. Then she turned to Kaelen. The Alpha stepped forward. He didn't look at the king. He looked only at her. He didn't reclaim a ward. He stood beside a peer. He took her hand, his fingers locking with hers, in a silent vow that felt more binding than any wedding rite. He looked at the human king and spoke words that would echo through the history of both kingdoms. "She is no longer yours to command. She is of the North now. She is ours. And if you cross this line again, you will find that the North does not just have a king, it has a queen." As they walked back into the depths of the forest, leaving the world of stone and silk behind, Lyra realized her life hadn't ended when she fled the palace. It had finally begun. High on the snow-capped peaks, under a sky full of indifferent stars, she stood with Kaelen. The princess was gone, replaced by a woman of the wild, a queen of the shadowed throne. The war was coming, she knew that, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't the prize to be won. She was the fire that would defend the home she had finally found. The transition from princess to pack member was not marked by a ceremony, but by the shedding of skin, both literal and metaphorical. In the weeks following her arrival, Lyra's soft, or palace-tended hands became a map of blisters and half-healed nicks. Her muscles, once only used for the shallow movements of courtly dance, burned with a constant, low-thrumming fire. Kaelen was a relentless shadow. He did not treat her with the fragile care her father's guards once had. He treated her like a soldier who was failing to meet the mark. "Again," he would growl, his voice like grinding stones. They stood in the center of the Stonefang training pit, a circular depression in the earth lined with packed mud and sharp, frosted gravel. Lyra lunged with her wooden practice blade, but Kaelen moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. He caught her wrist, twisted it just enough to make her gasp, and swept her feet out from under her. She hit the ground hard, the air leaving her lungs in a white puff of frost. "You're fighting like you're in a ballroom, Lyra," Kaelen said, looking down at her with those amber eyes that never seemed to blink. "You're waiting for the music to change. Here, the only music is the sound of your enemy's heartbeat. If you can't hear it, you're already dead." "I can't move as fast as you," she snapped, wiping mud from her cheek and pushing herself up. "I don't have the blood of the wolf in my veins." Kaelen stepped into her space, his presence overwhelming. He smelled of wood smoke and the sharp ozone scent of an approaching storm. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around her throat, not to choke, but to feel the pulse racing there. "You don't need the blood to have the spirit," he whispered, his thumb grazing her jawline. The wolf is not just the fur and the claw. It is the hunger. It is the refusal to be brought low. Find that hunger, or go back to Eldoria and let Valerius put you in a cage. The mention of Valerius acted like a spark in a dry forest. Something shifted in Lyra's gaze. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. She didn't wait for Kaelen to reset. She dove forward, using her smaller stature to roll between his legs. Before he could turn, she swung her wooden stave, catching him across the back of his thighs. Kaelen stumbled. A mere inch, but it was the first time she had moved him. He turned, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. It wasn't the smile of a man who had won. It was the smile of a man who had finally found a partner. "Better," he said, his voice dropping to a low purr. As the days bled into weeks, the training shifted from the pit to the wild. Kaelen took her deep into the whispering pines, teaching her to track. They moved through the undergrowth like two ghosts. He taught her how to read the snapped twig, the disturbed moss, and the scent of fear on the wind. One evening, as a heavy snow began to fall, they took shelter beneath a massive outcropping of slate. The fire between them was small, more for light than warmth, as the Lycans preferred the cold. Lyra shivered, pulling her fur cloak tighter. "Why did you really come back for me?" she asked, her voice small against the howling wind. "In the market, you could have just run." Kaelen stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "I didn't come back for a princess. I came back for the only person in Eldoria who looked at a beast and saw a soul. We are fated to our mates, Lyra. It is a pull in the blood, a tether that spans the world. When you touched my fur in that cage, the tether snapped taut. I didn't have a choice. I would have burned your father's city to the ground to find you." Lyra felt a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the scar on Kaelen's forearm, the one she had given him during their first real spar. "I felt it too," she admitted. "In the palace, I felt like I was fading away, like I was a ghost haunting my own life. But when I saw you, I felt solid for the first time." Kaelen moved closer, the distance between them vanishing. He took her hand, his rough palm pressing against hers. "There is a war coming, Lyra. Your father will not let a beast keep his prize. He will bring iron and silver. He will bring the priests and their holy fire." "Let him come," Lyra said, her voice growing stronger. "He thinks he's coming to rescue a daughter. He doesn't realize he's coming to face a pack." Kaelen leaned in, his lips inches from hers. "You aren't just pack, Lyra. You are the Alpha's heart. And I will tear the throat out of any man who tries to take you." He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of salt and wildness, a kiss that sealed her fate more firmly than any royal decree ever could. In that moment, the Princess of Eldoria truly died, and the Wolf Queen of the North was born. As the snow piled high outside their shelter, the two of them sat in the silence of the woods. They knew the peace wouldn't last. The scouts had already reported smoke on the horizon. The Eldorian vanguard was moving. Valerius was coming, fueled by a humiliation that only blood could wash away. But as Lyra watched Kaelen shift into his massive black wolf form to keep watch for the night, she didn't feel afraid. She curled into his side, her hand resting on his flank, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. The South was coming with its laws and its chains, but the North was waiting with its teeth. The sky over the red pass bled a bruised purple as the Eldorian army marched. From the high ridges, Lyra watched the snaking line of steel and torches. There were hundreds of them, far more than the small scouting party she had expected. Her father wasn't just coming for a daughter. He was coming to colonize the wild. Beside her, Kaelen stood in his human form, his chest bare despite the biting wind. His skin was decorated with charcoal markings, the runes of the first pack. To his left, Haris and the other warriors waited in a tense, vibrating silence. "They bring the sun priests," Kaelen muttered, his eyes narrowed at the glowing golden censers carried at the front of the human line. "They intend to use holy fire to keep us from shifting." Lyra gripped the hilt of her blade, the leather wrap warm against her palm. "The priests rely on the wind to carry the smoke. If we drop from the crags before they reach the narrowest point, the smoke will be useless." Kaelen turned to her, a flicker of pride softening his hard features. "You've learned the terrain well, little wolf." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "If I fall today, you lead them. You are the heartbeat of this pack now." "Don't talk of falling," she commanded, her voice like iron. "I didn't leave a palace to become a widow in the snow." The first horn blast from the valley below signaled the human advance. Lord Valerius led the vanguard, his silver-plated armor gleaming like a beacon of arrogance. He rode a massive white war horse, looking every bit the hero the Eldorian poets sang about. But Lyra saw him for what he was, a man who needed 1,000 soldiers to feel brave. "Now!" Kaelen commanded. The silence of the mountain shattered. It wasn't a roar that started the battle, but a synchronized howl that seemed to come from the very rocks themselves. Kaelen shifted mid-air as he leaped from the ledge, his body elongating into the massive, midnight black wolf. Behind him, dozens of Stonefang warriors followed, a cascade of fur and teeth falling upon the Eldorian line. Lyra didn't shift. She couldn't. But she moved with a speed that mirrored them. She slid down the snowy embankment, her blade drawn. She hit the ground behind the line of sun priests. Before they could swing their censers to release the silver-laced smoke, she was a whirlwind of steel. She moved low, cutting through the priests' robes and kicking the golden vessels into the snow. "The princess!" someone screamed. "Capture the princess!" Valerius turned his horse, his eyes widening as he saw Lyra. She was covered in mud and blood, her hair braided tight against her head, looking nothing like the girl he had tried to claim. "You've turned into a savage, Lyra," he bellowed, drawing his broadsword and spurring his horse toward her. "I've turned into a survivor," she yelled back. As the horse bore down on her, she didn't move. She waited until the beast was heartbeats away. Then she dove into the snow, rolling beneath the horse's belly. With a precise, brutal strike, she hamstrung the animal. The horse went down with a scream, throwing Valerius into the slush. Nearby, the battle was a chaotic symphony of snarls and the clatter of iron. Kaelen was a black blur, tearing through the Eldorian ranks. He was a force of nature, his jaws snapping through plate armor as if it were parchment. But the humans were gaining ground through sheer numbers, their pikes forming a deadly wall of silver-tipped points. Valerius scrambled to his feet, his silver armor now caked in filth. He swung his sword with a desperate, clumsy power. Lyra met him, her shorter blade parrying his strikes. She was faster, her movements honed by weeks of Kaelen's relentless training. "Your father will execute you for this," Valerius hissed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "My father lost his daughter the moment he sold her to a man like you," she replied. She feinted a high strike, then spun, her blade catching the gap in his armor at the waist. Valerius let out a choked cry, falling to one knee. A sudden, brilliant light erupted from the center of the pass. A high priest had managed to ignite a grand pyre of silver dust. The air became thick with a shimmering, toxic mist. Lyra saw Kaelen stumble, his wolf form flickering, his strength sapped by the silver in the air. "Kaelen!" she screamed. The Eldorian soldiers closed in on the weakened Alpha, their pikes raised for the kill. Lyra didn't think. She sprinted through the mist, her lungs burning as she inhaled the silver dust. It didn't affect her human blood, but the heat of it was like breathing glass. She threw herself in front of Kaelen's massive form, her sword held high. "Back!" she roared, her voice amplified by the canyon walls. "I am the blood of Theron." If you kill him, you kill your princess first. The soldiers hesitated. They had been raised to obey the crown, and the sight of Lyra, bleeding, fierce, and standing guard over a beast, broke their resolve. In that moment of hesitation, the wind shifted. A sudden, violent gust from the north, perhaps called by the ancient spirits of the woods, swept the silver mist back toward the Eldorian army. Kaelen shook his head, his strength returning in a surge of primal fury. He let out a howl that shook the very foundation of the pass. The Stonefang Pack rallied, their yellow eyes glowing through the receding smoke. Valerius tried to stand, yes, but Kaelen was on him in a heartbeat. The Alpha didn't kill him. He pinned him to the ground with a massive paw, his teeth inches from the noble's throat. "Yield," Lyra commanded, looking at the Eldorian vanguard, "or there will be no one left to tell my father why his army never returned." One by one, the soldiers dropped their pikes. The clatter of iron on stone marked the end of the Eldorian dream of conquest. As the sun began to rise over the blood-stained snow, Lyra walked to Kaelen. He shifted back into his human form, his skin steaming in the cold air. He looked at her, his eyes raw with emotion. "You saved the pack," he whispered, his voice thick. "I saved my home," she corrected. They stood together at the mouth of the pass, looking down at the retreating remnants of the Eldorian army. They knew this wasn't the end. Theron would be back, and the world would only get darker. But as the pack gathered around them, bumping heads and whining in victory, Lyra knew they were ready. The Princess of Eldoria was a ghost. The Wolf Queen was a legend, and the North was finally, truly wild.